So how do you read ancient texts? Why did they even write them? And how are they different in the East than they are in the West? There's a lot of tricky information out there now, and I have an upcoming course where I'm going to be describing how to read ancient texts and understand astrology and the cultures of East and West a lot better. I'm making this video to discuss the upcoming class that I am putting forth on the ancient texts, on understanding ancient texts. This is going to be an excellent class that is happening on May 30th to June 27th, and it's one class each week for 4 weeks and also one live video call. And this text is going to give an overview of how to approach learning about astrology, or really any ancient knowledge, especially from India, and how to read and understand what's conveyed in the texts, why they're written a certain way, the difference between Indian and Western approaches for even writing texts. You'll also get a primer of Indian concepts such as dharma, karma, gunas, elements, those kinds of things that really underpin Indian thinking. Again, the difference between the text in India and texts from the West. You might be shocked to learn that, you know, a book in the West is looked at a certain way, a specific way and for a specific reason, and you bring all kinds of your bias to even looking at that book from a Western mind, and it's probably completely different than the reason it was written in the East, for example. Literally, there's a completely different structure and even reason for writing the text. The difference between Shruti and Smriti, which is that which delineates that which is heard versus that which is written. And in fact, one of the main reasons why Indian texts were written at all was to be an aid eventually to something that was supposed to have been memorized. For example, I'm going to talk about this in a minute in greater detail. But again, also things like a basic overview of Indian exegesis and how the texts were arranged and the different devices used. For example, repetition. If something is stated more than once, it's more important. Hyperbole. If something is exaggerated, it's just meant to be bigger. Also, things like where it's placed at the beginning is more important than later. For example, these are all devices. So, for example, when you read in books things like, you know, you'll get elephants and you'll get snake bites and leprosy and boils and all these things, and you think, well, that has nothing to do with me. I'm never going to come across elephant in my whole life. That's just a device. So also how to migrate those concepts to modern terms will also be discussed. And also different classifications of texts and sciences. This, again, is huge because there are entire different classes of texts. For instance, Vedas, Upavedas. These are sort of spiritual science texts from a long time ago. They were more mystical and metaphysical. Then you have Vedangas, which are texts like Jyotish texts, literally like how to practice a certain science, like an Ayurveda text or Vedic Astrology text, which literally describes how to practice something. Then there are other texts like the Puranas, which are sort of religious in nature. Now, of course, they all contain different references and can refer back to each other, but it's not that you shouldn't look at them for context, but it's being able to read them with the right discrimination. You wouldn't read a text like the Vishnu Purana or the Bhagavata Purana or the Mahabharata or the Ramayana the same way you would read Brihat Parashara Sastra, because one is literally how to practice Vedic astrology, how to erect a horoscope and find planets. You wouldn't look at things, you know, different, for instance, cosmological references in those other texts. You wouldn't look at it the same way because it's being written for a different reason. Just like you wouldn't look at an astronomical text or a science book, like, for instance, a book on anatomy. You wouldn't look at that the same way you would look at a book on how to practice Ayurveda. One is a structural text. For instance, the Surya Siddhanta is an astronomy text. It doesn't tell you how to, it's not there for erecting horoscopes or practicing astrology, for example. It's an astronomy text. You wouldn't look at the text on anatomy for how to practice Ayurveda. They're different and they're for different reasons. Nor if you see a reference in Ayurveda or certain kinds of things that might lead to anger or something in a text about, you know, Lord Shiva, you wouldn't necessarily use that for your Ayurveda practice because that's not the context. So literally how to read the different texts, because this is where there's a lot of confusion now about things, you know, large and small. Some large, like for instance, we all know there's been a debate the last several years about zodiacs. A lot of that confusion comes from pulling a sentence out of a book, maybe like an astronomy book or a Purana, you know, one of the Puranic texts, and trying to apply this to reading astrology charts. They're different classifications of texts. And I have many resources that I'm going to be exposing you to in the course. Different writers and authors who have talked about this. There are many resources that you can tap into, that I've tapped into, that I'm going to be exposing people to in the ancient text course itself. So again, these different classifications of text, this is a huge, huge issue. And so like also things like the literal analysis of these principles in Vedic astrology texts, as well as the history and culture of Indian astrology. So again, just understanding how one body of texts led to others. And that includes going back into the mists of time, into the earliest Vedic astrology text and earliest Indian astrological references like the Vedanga Jyotisha from the Rig Veda and from the Yajur Veda, looking and seeing exactly how they were using astrology back then and what the origin is even of astrology itself, why it was even used and how we can build on that for this modern world. Now again, the price of this course is only $47. I'm keeping it very affordable so that anyone who has even a passing interest will be able to register. Now for people who have already registered for my level 1 certification course this year, will already have this included if you get the full access to my level 1 certification course. Because I want people to be able to understand this, this is an extension of the core body of knowledge that people should know before they even start studying Vedic astrology at all. So I just went over the class 1 overview. Again, it's 4 weeks. These are the 4 weeks. You know, the second class is an overview of the Vedic astrology text themselves. First is just an overview of the ancient texts and how to approach them, the different, you know, categories and classifications. But then we're going to get into the Vedic astrology texts themselves, which astrology text to use and for what and why. Perhaps the most important part of the course. Why would we use something like Brihat Parashara Hora Sastra and Jaimini Sutras? Which translation? How can we unravel these kinds of things? What are the important sections of Brihat Parashara Hora Sastra that reveals why this is the default text for this type of astrology? Also, why different translations is not usually the problem when studying Vedic astrology. Again, you hear these you know, what are called like red herrings, these sort of false statements about, well, which translation do you use? Which one should we use? For the most part, it's not a matter of the translation. Most translations are, I wouldn't say close enough because that sounds very sloppy, but the issue is not with the translation, it's with the text itself. It's more important that you understand that you're looking at Brihat Parashara Hora Sastra than looking at Paladipika or even Brihat Jataka for most things, for the horoscopic astrology. Not because those other texts have nothing to offer. Again, I'm going to explain to you which texts offer what. But it's more important that you know which ones are the most authoritative, which ones to come down on, and which text to read for what other kinds of things, because everything isn't covered in Brihat Parashara or Sastra. But what is in that text, especially the important sections of it, should always be used for that type of astrology. But again, there are other things, especially as it relates to Muhurta factors, where you need to look at Brihat Samhita, Brihat Jataka. Also, the other important texts are Muhurta Chintamani, Kala Prakashika for the Muhurta factors. There's also one called Tajika Nilikanta for the Tajik astrology. So I'm going to show which text you need to focus on, so you can whittle your library down to like the 5 or 6 important texts that you need, and how to read them and look at them yourself. This is going to open up the whole world of astrology to you, in my opinion anyway, because that's really where you start to become more than just a kind of passive receptacle saying, oh, I don't know why he said it. He says this, he says that, who knows? Well, you will know, because some of the biggest problems that we have in this era now is this era of sort of fake news and, everybody with a YouTube channel is an expert now. And again, it's a tricky and difficult thing. And again, it's not to disparage anyone's work. People are doing their best and whatnot. But, if you haven't been looking at these things for like a decade or so, you can get really lost. And again, there are a lot of issues that I'll be talking about. Some of them also have to do with why, for example, learning Sanskrit. It's obviously, I honor anyone who has learned Sanskrit. It's an entire language. It's a very deep language. But again, you don't have to learn Sanskrit in order to be able to know which texts to use and know how to approach using them and for what reason. I've seen many people who can, translate Sanskrit, and they just muck it up terribly. It's not in and of itself some superpower which automatically gives you legitimacy beyond question. You've had people who have translated Sanskrit texts for, hundreds of years. We have hundreds of years of texts from great Sanskrit translators. So these aren't necessarily the skills that you need. What you need is discrimination to be able to understand which text to look at for what purpose, and which translations to use and where to find the important resources, again, as I'm saying, and again, which parts of the most important text should you focus on? How can you tell where to put most of your attention when reading the text? And what this shows you about yourself as a modern astrologer. So again, this means that you need to take the power back so that you're not just passively receiving things and not understanding why. You will also, be able to see through when astrologers, especially like online and the plethora of, frankly, just, incomplete information is coming at you without a textual basis or a factual basis. And by the way, I also just want to say, it doesn't mean that every single thing that an astrologer does needs to be written explicitly in a text. Again, this is the other thing that I'm going to be describing, is how to be able to tell when someone is going against a text or going against the teaching. Again, I'm not saying they're doing it intentionally, but when what they're saying is anathema to the principles in the texts themselves. Because some of the best work that we all do as astrologers isn't explicitly written in a text. It's where you start to fill in the gaps and your intuition puts these principles together. And it's hard to tell when an astrologer, frankly, is just kind of making things up that are against the teaching, and when they're actually doing something where their intuition and their inner genius is coming forth. So again, these are the things that I'm going to talk about in the course, and it'll be very clear. Once you learn how to read the texts, you'll be able to see and know and recognize for yourself when a teacher is, again, really bringing out something that is, extending the teachings and modernizing them and doing things that are deeply connected to the principles, and when they're kind of going against things and they're kind of damaging the teaching and they're sort of making things up because they don't have the experience and because they're just making connections that aren't there. there's a lot of this happening now. For example, it's very easy to look at something that's maybe related to a zodiac sign, for example. And then because it's related to the zodiac sign, then start to attribute every quality of a zodiac sign to this one very narrow and specific thing that is referenced. I'll give an example. For example, there's a lot being talked about with nakshatrapadas these days. Nakshatrapadas are 1/4 of a nakshatra. They're also connected, as Varahamihira says, and as we all know, to the Navamsha chart. And the Navamsha chart are zodiac signs. So the first Navamsha of Aries is also Aries, but like the first Navamsha of Leo is also Aries. So the Navamsha, which are also the Nakshatrapadas, are connected to astrology signs. So then it's very easy to say, oh, well, they're signs. Okay, so now they have this element, they have this guna, they have this ruler, they have all of these things. And then we start bringing all of this into that area where that might not be shown by the texts, or that might just be taking something in a direction that's not really, supported. So these kinds of issues, and I'm not necessarily saying that's one, but there's a lot of ways where it's easy to get tripped up and where we're not really sure what we should be doing and how to read through what appears to be conflicts and unravel difficulty. I'm going to give an example in an upcoming video, so you want to look out for that. But in this video, I just wanted to give a sort of overview of this course. And, again, it's starting on May 30th. That's when I'm going to be putting up the first class in the Ancient Text course. And then, again, it takes place in your home. You don't have to worry about appointments or anything like that. There's a link to this page here that has the information. So I just wanted to give an overview of it in this video, and I hope to see you in the course. I'm sure you'll really get a lot out of it.